Before we talk about miracles, before we talk about earthquakes and open doors, before we talk about chains falling off and prisons breaking, I need you to stop. I need you to be honest with yourself for the next 20 minutes. Because this is not just a Bible story. This is a mirror. And the question this story asks is one of the most revealing questions you will ever face. So close your eyes for just a moment. I want you to imagine something. Imagine your back is bleeding. Not from a paper cut. Not from a bruise. Bleeding from wounds. Deep wounds. Wounds that were put there by people who had the power to hurt you and chose to use it. Imagine your body is locked in pain so severe that you cannot find a single position that gives you relief. You cannot stand up. The pain will not allow it. You cannot lie down. The stocks around your feet prevent it. You cannot even shift your weight without a new wave of agony moving through you. Now add to that the darkness. Not the comfortable darkness of a bedroom at night. The darkness of underground stone. The darkness of a place built specifically to remove all hope. Cold, damp, silent except for the distant sound of chains. You are in the deepest part of a Roman prison, and it is midnight. Now answer this honestly. Would you cry? Or would you worship? Take your time with that question. Because your answer reveals something about you. It reveals what you really believe about God when the lights go out. Not what you say you believe on Sunday morning. Not what you post. Not what you sing in a worship service when life is going well. What you believe when it is midnight, when nobody is watching, when the pain is real, when God feels silent. That is what this story is about. This is not a fictional story. This is not a legend passed down through generations and embellished along the way. This is a documented historical account recorded in the Acts of the Apostles. Chapter 16, written by a physician named Luke, who traveled with Paul himself and recorded what he witnessed with his own eyes. So before we enter the prison, before we feel the darkness, I want you to understand who these two men actually were. Because their story is more powerful when you know what they had already been through before this night. Paul, whose Hebrew name was Saul, was not born into faith. He was born into religion, and there is a profound difference between the two. He was a Pharisee, one of the most educated, most disciplined, most religiously accomplished men of his generation. He knew the scriptures from childhood. He had studied under Gamaliel, one of the greatest teachers in the history of Judaism. He was, in his own words, blameless according to the law, and he used every ounce of that religious power and influence. To persecute the early followers of Jesus, he dragged them from their homes. He put them in prison. He stood watching and approving when a man named Stephen, one of the first Christian martyrs, was stoned to death in the street. Paul knew what it felt like to put people in chains. And then, on a road to Damascus, everything changed. A blinding light, a voice, a question that shattered his entire identity. Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me? And in that moment, the man who had built his entire life on being right, God came face to face with the God he had been wrong about. He spent 3 days blind, 3 days without food or water, and when his sight returned, everything had changed. The man who had put Christians in prison became a Christian. The man who had stood over martyrs became willing to die for the same faith he had tried to destroy. By the time we meet Paul in Acts 16, he has already been beaten, already been shipwrecked, already been stoned and left for dead, already walked thousands of miles across the ancient world carrying a message that got him into trouble everywhere he went. Paul was not a man unfamiliar with suffering. He was a man who had learned something about suffering that most people never discover. Silas was chosen by Paul specifically for this journey. When Paul and Barnabas had a disagreement, a real, documented conflict between two men of God, it was Silas who stepped in as Paul's new traveling companion. The early church in Jerusalem described Silas as a prophet, a man who encouraged and strengthened the believers everywhere he went. He was a Roman citizen, like Paul, which will matter later in our story. But more than his credentials, Silas was the kind of man you want beside you when everything goes wrong. He was not famous. He was not the leader. He was not the one whose name would echo through history the way Paul's did. But he was faithful, and sometimes faithful is the most powerful thing a person can be. These two men, a transformed persecutor and a quiet prophet, were about to face a night that would test everything they believed. They had come to Philippi, a major Roman colony in Macedonia, because of a vision. Paul had seen a man from Macedonia in a dream, saying, "Come over and help us." They crossed into Europe because of that dream. In Philippi, they found a group of women praying by a river, and among them, a woman named Lydia, a dealer in purple cloth whose heart got open to receive the message Paul brought. It was a quiet beginning, a small group, a prayer meeting by a river, but God was building something. And then, as often happens when God is building something, the opposition arrived. There was a slave girl in Philippi. The Bible tells us she had a spirit of divination, and her owners were making significant money from her supposed ability to predict the future. For many days she followed Paul and Silas through the streets, crying out, "These men are servants of the Most High God, who proclaim to you the way of salvation." And here is something remarkable. What she was saying was true. She was not lying. She was not mocking them. But Paul, troubled by this, eventually turned and said to the spirit inside her, "I command you in the name of Jesus Christ to come out of her." So immediately it left. The girl was free. She was delivered from a spirit that had been exploiting her for as long as anyone could. Remember, this should have been a moment of celebration. This was healing. This was freedom. This was exactly the kind of thing Jesus had said his followers would do. But her owners, the men who had been profiting from her suffering, saw only one thing. Their income had just walked out the door. And so they did what powerful people do when righteousness threatens their profit. They turned to the system. They dragged Paul and Silas into the marketplace, into the public square, before the magistrates of the city. And they made their accusation. "These men are Jews, and they are disturbing our city. They are advocating customs that are not lawful for us as Romans to accept or practice." Notice what they did not say. They did not say, "These men healed someone." They did not say, "These men set a slave girl free." They appealed to Roman pride and Roman fear. They stirred up the crowd with the language of cultural threat. And it worked. The crowd joined in the attack. The magistrates tore off Paul and Silas's clothes, and they ordered them to be beaten with rods. Not warned, not tried, not given a chance to speak, just beaten. The Bible uses a specific word here. It says they were severely flogged. This was not a token punishment. Roman rod beatings were calculated to cause maximum pain. The rods were thick. The blows were delivered with force. And there was no limit to how many times they could strike. Their backs were torn open. Their bodies were weak. And when the beating was over, the magistrates did not let them go. They gave further orders to the jailer: throw them into the inner prison and guard them securely. Into the deepest place, the most secure cell, the place designed to make a person forget that the world above exists. And their feet were placed in stocks. This is where our story begins. It was midnight. In the ancient world, midnight was not simply a time on a clock. Midnight was a threshold. It was the deepest point of the night, the furthest distance from dawn, the point at which darkness had achieved its maximum reach. And Paul and Silas were at midnight in every sense of the word. Midnight, in the literal sense, the hour of deepest night. Midnight, in the physical sense, bodies broken, bleeding, unable to move. Midnight, in the circumstantial sense, unjustly imprisoned, far from home, with no visible path to freedom. And perhaps most profoundly, midnight in the spiritual sense. Because in moments like this, the silence of God can feel louder than any earthquake. Where are you, God? Did you not see what happened to us? Did you not see what they did? We were doing your work. We were following your vision. We crossed into Macedonia because you told us to come. We freed a girl from bondage in your name. And this is where obedience brought us. Into a dungeon, with torn backs and locked feet and no one who knows where we are. The Bible does not tell us that Paul and Silas were not afraid. It does not tell us they did not feel pain. It does not tell us they had some supernatural emotional armor that normal human beings do not have. They were men, flesh and blood, with nerve endings that felt every blow, with hearts that had been through enough to know that the situation was serious. Their faith was not the absence of feeling. Their faith was a choice made in the presence of feeling other men who had perhaps been in that prison for months or years, were watching Paul and Silas, listening, waiting, because in prison, the thing that matters most is not your crime. It is not your sentence. In prison, the thing that matters most is how you carry your suffering. And every prisoner in that place was about to see something that none of them had ever witnessed before. About midnight, Paul and Silas were praying and singing hymns to God, and the other prisoners were listening to them. In pain, in chains, in stocks, in darkness, they prayed and they sang. Not quietly, not secretly, not in a whisper they hoped no one would hear. They sang in a way that the other prisoners could hear them. They worshipped out loud in the middle of the worst night of their lives. Why did they worship? First, they worshipped because they knew who God was. Paul had written, or would later write these words, "I have learned in whatever state I am to be content." Learning implies experience. It implies failure and trying again. It implies going through the thing you did not want to go through and discovering on the other side that God was in it. Paul knew from years of experience, from beatings and shipwrecks and stonings and imprisonments, that God was not absent in his suffering. God was present in it. Worship was not a denial of the pain. It was an affirmation of a presence that was greater than the pain. Second, they worshipped because worship is a weapon. In the Old Testament, in the book of 2 Chronicles, there is an extraordinary account of King Jehoshaphat facing a vast army that was marching to destroy Judah, and God gave him an unusual military strategy. He said, "Send the worshipers out first, not the soldiers, not the archers, not the cavalry. The worshipers." And the Bible records that as they began to sing and praise, the enemy became confused and destroyed themselves. Judah did not have to lift a single weapon. Worship is not passive. Worship is not weakness. Worship is warfare at the deepest spiritual level. Third, they worshipped. Because someone else was listening, the Bible does not mention the other prisoners by accident. The other prisoners were listening to them. Paul and Silas were not just worshiping for themselves. Whether they knew it or not, whether they could see it in the darkness or not, their worship was a sermon. Their midnight song was the most powerful testimony those other prisoners had ever heard. Because anyone can sing when life is good. Anyone can praise God when the doors are open and the chains are loose and the sun is shining. But to sing when the doors are locked and the chains are on and it is midnight, that is a testimony that changes people. And then the Bible uses one of the most powerful single words in the entire account. Suddenly, there was a great earthquake, so violent that the foundations of the prison were shaken. The foundations trembled. The walls cracked. Every door flew open, and every chain fell loose. Not just Paul and Silas's chains. Everyone's. The blessing of their worship overflowed to every person in that prison. The jailer. The man whose name we do not know. The man who had locked Paul and Silas in the deepest cell and fastened their feet in the stocks. This man woke up in the middle of the earthquake, and when he saw the prison doors open, every single one of them, he drew his sword. He was about to take his own life because the alternative was worse. And then from somewhere inside that open, chain-scattered, earthquake-damaged prison, a voice, loud, clear, urgent, "Don't harm yourself. We are all here." The jailer called for lights. He rushed in. He fell trembling before Paul and Silas. And then he asked the question, "Sirs, what must I do to be saved?" The man who put them in chains became a brother in the faith. The hands that locked the stocks became the hands that washed the wounds. God is not absent in your midnight. Worship shifts the atmosphere. Your obedience has consequences you cannot see. Freedom is not the absence of chains. So what is your midnight right now? What is the thing in your life that feels like a locked door? What is the situation that you have prayed about until you ran out of words and heaven still seems silent? Worship does not change your circumstances immediately. Worship changes your position within your circumstances. It moves you from victim of the midnight to overcomer in the midnight. And from that position, everything is possible. You still have a choice tonight. You can let the midnight have the last word, or you can open your mouth in the darkness, in the pain, in the uncertainty, and give the last word to God. You can complain, or you can worship. And one of those will open doors. The earthquake is not late. It is simply waiting for the song.